You hear a name and you expect justice. But what if that name had lived 2 blocks away for 36 years, fixing your roof, smiling at church bake sales, leaving flowers on the 4th of July? Well, a little girl's laughter stayed frozen in a photograph. In 1968, 9-year-old Evie Hart vanished from the steps of Lincoln Elementary in Kalamazoo. The town burned with questions. The case cooled into rumor and ritual. Then in 2004, a single thread pulled everything tight. DNA from a small, brittle scrap of fabric, hidden in a shoebox at the county lab, matched a man who'd been part of the town's face for decades. He was not who the town had been prepared to hate. That's when the real story opened. And the secret that would shatter more than one life was finally forced into the light. Stay with me, because nothing about what you think you know is what it seems. Before we dive deeper, take a second to hit subscribe and smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming your way. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. You must imagine Evie Hart first as the small, ordinary miracle she was. A braid of dark hair that never stayed in its ribbon. A chipped front tooth she showed off like a prize. A habit of folding her hands under her chin and listening as if the world told its best stories when no one else was watching. She lived in a tired yellow house on West Kalamazoo Avenue with her mother, Martha, who worked the late shift at the hospital, and her father, Tom, who turned wrenches at the bus garage. They were the sort of family that paid attention to the small lights: a supper plate left warm, a note on the fridge, a shoe left crooked on the step, and the whole neighborhood watched their every small, careful move, because that's what neighborhoods did then. It was September of 1968, a day bruised by a September wind and the smell of chalk and new pencils. Evie was dropped off at school by a neighbor whose truck she loved to watch, a neighbor who would never forget waving goodbye as the little girl ran up the steps toward her classroom. She said goodbye to her mother in the same way she always did, a quick hug, a promise to mind her manners. Someone, a friend, maybe a teacher, later remembered Evie's laugh in the hallway. Then, by the time the first bell finished its last ring, her desk was empty. For the first hour, the school thought she was late. Late girls were marched through the office, given a scolding and a note for the record. When the lunchtime bell arrived and Evie's name was not on the roster for the cafeteria, the teacher began to worry. Her little lunchbox sat under the coat rack, untouched. A pencil case, one pink eraser. Someone checked the lost and found. Someone checked the supply closet. A janitor, Mr. Wallace, a kind man with a penchant for humming old hymns, remembered sweeping steps. He remembered Evie's little shoe by the bench. He remembered, with that odd cruelty of memory, that he had tied a different child's shoelace that morning, but not hers. When the police arrived, the town pivoted. Blue uniforms filled the schoolyard. Mothers stopped mid-step on porches and held babies like shields. The Harts watched the search grow, block by block, field by field, into an ache that would not fold. The sheriff's team interviewed every teacher, every crossing guard, every kid who might have been playing hooky by the sycamores. They combed the alleys, the abandoned warehouses by the river, the underbrush behind the church where teenagers dared each other with small, whispered stories. They found nothing but a faint perfume on a swing and scuffed dirt by the fence, a smear on a chain link that might have been print or might have been a trick of the light. Rumors were quick to fill the silence. A stranger in a gray sedan had been seen near the school. A man in a truck had offered gum, and a story about a lost dog. A whispered name would circle the grocery store and then die in some other neighbor's mouth. People pointed at other people the way a storm points at windows, without naming the real wind. The Harts endured the gaze of pity and suspicion. Someone published a flyer with Evie's photograph and the word missing in block letters, and the town folded the flyer into its pockets and pressed it into the trees and the lampposts like small prayers. But months became years. The sheriff's office kept a crate of paper records with Evie's name penciled on the lid. Detectives came and went. Witnesses moved away. A teacher retired. The seasons layered themselves over the case like coats of paint. Evie's school desk remained, and in the Hart kitchen the note, behind the phone that said call if anything became a talisman that no one dared erase. The thing about cold cases is that they are not dead things. They are slow, hungry things that become part of the geography of a place. They rearrange Thanksgiving tables and birthday presents. They carve anniversaries in the calendars of the people who survive them. Every year, Martha set a small, battered vase at the kitchen window and put a yellow mum in it. For neighbors, the ritual was a reminder. For the Harts, it was their heartbeat. Time does strange things to both memory and motive. People forget the shape of faces, but not the temperature of small mercies. Some suspects were written on the pages of old files with blue ink. Men who had been questioned and cleared, men who had been in the area and had no alibi. One man, a drifter, had been seen loitering near the playground that fall and was brought in twice for questioning, his shirt smelling of exhaust. He was released for lack of evidence. Another suspect was a teacher's aide who'd been overly familiar with pupils. He left town months later under the weight of gossip. The town always seemed to find someone to point at, someone who could be the answer they yearned for. And then the answer would dissolve under the microscope of official inquiry. Decades passed. The Hart family aged like many families do. Birthdays without candles, holidays with fewer plates. Evie's picture, in a frame with a dented edge, watched every meal. Tom, who had once been solid as a foundation, started to go to the hardware every afternoon and stand by the counter without buying anything. Martha grew thin and small around the edges, though she took walks and kept her garden in a way that made people think she had found a new rhythm. The town replaced the old brick of Lincoln Elementary with a modern block building. Kids grew up. New families took the old porches. The list of names in the sheriff's crate remained, their writing growing paler as the ink aged. Then in the late 1990s, as digital records began to crawl into police work and as DNA began to feel less like science fiction and more like a civil servant, talk started again. Cold case units appeared in small towns like Kalamazoo the way rumors do, small, stubborn, impossible to ignore. Frank Monroe, the detective who had worked the original inquiry as a young man and carried Evie's case like a stone in his shoe for 36 years, began to collect things. He was retired now, the face of a man who had seen too much to be startled. And yet he could not let the file go. He believed that every piece of evidence, no matter how small, might fold into a shape that revealed the truth. It was Frank who found the shoebox. That shoebox was a kind of thing police departments keep and then forget. A corrugated container with the department's name stamped lightly on the side, filled with paper notes, glove fragments, a tiny pattern of dried coffee rings, and most importantly, a small scrap of fabric that had been carefully labeled in 1968 as possible transfer, black knit. It had been cataloged, assigned a number, and then set aside because at the time the science to analyze it properly did not exist. Frank sat at his kitchen table with the box and a lamp and opened it the way a guilty man opens a ledger. It was a small thing, a ribbon of cloth, no larger than the palm of his hand, the fibers stiff with age. It had been folded inside a paperback copy of a children's book that had been used in the school library. The type of book Evie might have loved. Someone had tucked the scrap inside the pages like a press leaf. The handwriting on the label was neat and official. Scrap from neck of knit sweater found near playground. Possible contact. Frank took it to the lab. Science, for all its careful, precise mirrors, has a way of turning the past into a language you can begin to read. In 2004, the county's cold case unit, a small team with a microscope, a computer terminal, and a scientist who still smoked cigarettes behind the building, extracted what they could from the scrap. They found fibers. They found traces of blood that had resisted complete decomposition. Most crucially, with the advances in DNA amplification that had matured in the previous decade, they were able to profile what remained of the sample. What the profile revealed was a chain. It matched a man who had been entered into the state database years earlier after an unrelated arrest. The database spit back a name and a number, and the room, which had been humming with quiet analysis, went abruptly quiet. His name was Arthur King. He was, in 1968, a custodian and a part-time driver for the school district. By 2004, he had moved from Kalamazoo and was 63 years old, renting a tidy house on the edge of a different town, wearing the same small smile that made him neighborly and unthreatening. He had been the kind of man who served on committees, church committees, recycling committees, who never missed a letter and who brought pies to potlucks with a flourish. The DNA match was not a rumor or a fancy. It was a number on a screen and then a name. When the police knocked on Arthur Keene's door on an icy morning in January, neighbors peered from behind curtains and found their tidy assumptions slipping. He answered the door in a cardigan and did not rise when the detective read the warrant. His first words were an almost mechanical request for coffee. He had the sort of small-town politeness that often hides the most surprising things. Arthur was taken in for questioning. He had been a fixture at Lincoln Elementary for years. He had the key to doors. He had been in the hallways when teachers were preparing classrooms, and he had been the one to check the boilers when the pipes groaned. To many, he had been a helper. To the Hart family, when the arrest was announced, he became the most hated man in town. The press smelled the story like a hound. The radio station played sound bites that felt like salt. But DNA is a cruel thing, as well as a merciful one. It tells a truth that is stubbornly literal. The sample on the knit scrap matched Arthur to the degree that the lab was willing to stake its reputation on the result. The news cameras circled the courthouse like scavengers, and for the first time in 36 years Martha and Tom sat in a small room with someone who said they had found evidence that could lead to answers. What followed was the slow, terrible machinery of justice. Arthur was indicted. The prosecution assembled its case like a mosaic. Witness statements that had lain fallow for decades, a motive guessed at and then widened by the facts. Inconsistencies in Arthur's recollections of those days that suddenly looked less like forgetfulness and more like gaps. The defense argued crossways. Contamination, lab error, misidentification. In the past, people had been convicted on far less. Modern juries were more skeptical. They had seen TV shows and forensic dramas and knew to ask for proof. During the preliminary hearings, a detail came forward that no one had expected. A woman named Lillian, who had been a teenager in 1968 and had worked after school at the bus station, came forward with a memory she had not told anyone before. She remembered a man in the janitor's closet that day, nervous and sweating and talking to himself. She didn't name Arthur then. Her memory was a photograph, not an inscription. But when she saw his face on television, something in her chest unclenched like a fist opening. Her testimony did not decide the case, but it added to the narrative like a breath being found after drowning. In the weeks that followed, as courtroom lights glared and the town took sides, more things surfaced in odd ways. A rusted locket found in a storm drain that had once been Evie's. A pattern of small donations Arthur had made to charity that some called an attempt at penance. A letter from a prisoner decades earlier that hinted at knowledge he did not have. The story took on the quality of a house being rewritten from an old blueprint. Walls shifted, rooms renamed. Secrets that had been built into the foundations coming out as the old plaster crumbled. I do not tell you this as a clean ending. At trial, the prosecution rested on DNA. They argued that the presence of Arthur's DNA on an item associated with Evie was not a quirk of fate. It was the mark of contact in a context that made no sense. The defense asked jurors to consider contamination, to remember that labs make mistakes, that human beings had boxed, labeled, and refiled things for decades. They urged them to look at the whole picture and not simply at numbers on a screen. The jury deliberated for many long hours. When they reached a verdict, the courtroom held its breath as if it were about to hear the last line of a long poem. Arthur was convicted. The town erupted and folded and then moved on in many of the ways towns do, with anger, with relief, with a strange, numb fatigue. For the Harts, the verdict gave them something they had been denied, a name to rage against, the sense that the law had in its imperfect, delayed way sided with them. A small justice, perhaps, a fragile thing. Martha cried for the day she had been given, and then she cried for the day she still wanted. But here is the twist that stayed with the town years later, and that is the part one leave you with, because it is the part that calls for second look. After the conviction, As reporters packed up their lights and as the Hart family tried in fits and starts to begin living again, an envelope arrived at the sheriff's office. No return address. Inside was a photograph, a Polaroid, edges yellowed, taken on a summer afternoon in 1968. It showed a picnic at Riverside Park, kids with ice cream faces, someone holding Evie high as she squealed. In the back of the photograph, on an edge where nothing should be written, someone had penciled a note. There was a second truck. The sheriff opened the envelope with the same kind of care Frank had used with the shoebox years before. The Polaroid was the sort of evidence the human heart loves and the legal mind mistrusts. It suggested another presence, another vehicle, someone else watching. There were patterns in the old files, reports of strangers seen that week, of a truck idling by the school, that never quite fit the neat, closed story everyone had settled on. Was Arthur the lone actor in a long, terrible play? Or was he one face in a crowded, shifting cast? The conviction provided a person who would pay for the crime, finally. But it did not dissolve every question. The photograph flung one of those questions back into the light. A second truck. A second man. Or, more terrifyingly, the implication that what the DNA had revealed was only a part of a deeper pattern. A pattern that might reach across county lines and into other records that had long been muted. Martha held the Polaroid in her hands like a relic. She kissed the corner of Evie's dress and whispered to the photograph the way a prayer sometimes becomes a conversation when the living have been denied answers. Was there someone else? She asked no one. Did people look away? The town, too, had to sit with the idea that justice, even when served in the narrow sense, can leave rooms in the heart unlit. There's one more thing that makes this story feel less like an ending and more like the turning of an old, heavy page. Arthur, in the weeks after the verdict, refused to speak in any meaningful way about Evie. He offered no confession that would explain his DNA, no story that would light up the map of the town and show where the truth had traveled. He died in prison 3 years later, a clean, ennobling end for some, a wound reopen for others. His death gave the town a finality that felt like a coin. One side comfort, the other side loss. But the Polaroid was still there. The second truck note had no signature. In small towns, paper is a language everyone knows how to read, folded flyers, postmarked letters. The way a lawn is left uncut as a message. The unsolved edge of this case became an asterisk. Yes, men were punished. And yet the photograph suggested a story longer than the one in the courtroom. The real shock, then, was not just that a man the town had known could be the answer. The shock was how many ways a small community could misread the script for decades, how trust could be weaponized, how comfort could blind the people who most needed to pay attention. The case did not simply reveal a culprit. It revealed the slow complacency of a place that believed in its own goodness until confronted with its limits. I tell you this because the story is not finished. Evie's name changed how the town bent toward its children. Teachers instituted new drop-off rules. The school built locked vestibules. New parents took the pains of safety for granted. Cold case units in neighboring counties took note. But somewhere in an old filing cabinet there remains a faded, coffee-ringed reporter's notebook and the Polaroid with its pencil note. In a way that makes you feel the old wound and the new crust at the same time, it asks the same question again. How many truths are there in a life? And which ones are we willing to accept? If you leaned in this far, there is a continuation you deserve, because the Polaroid's penciled message started a ripple that did not stop when a name was read into a microphone. New eyes started to look through old files. Cold case detectives across the state compared notes. Someone in another county found a photograph that might be linked. Whispers began to suggest that Evie's disappearance was not an isolated act of a desperate man, but part of something larger. Something that survived in the interstices of bus routes and construction sites and the closed doors of small rooms. And then, on a rainy evening 2 years after Arthur's conviction, Frank received a phone call. The caller said 3 words and then hung up. Check the maps. Frank kept the maps. He spread them on the table as he had once spread them in offices that no longer smelled of cigarette smoke. Roads, river curves, bus routes, the places children walked to school. He traced them with an old finger. There, in the margin of one small sheet, in a place no one had thought to look, because it was too small, too banal to matter, he saw a scribble. Someone, an officer long retired, had drawn a tiny box. Inside it, a short dash of pencil. No one could say, on that rainy night, what it meant. But the box matched the Polaroid. It matched a place where a second truck had been seen, an image that had been dismissed as the imagination of a frightened adult. So we leave it there for now, with a map, a Polaroid, a shoebox, and the memory of a 9-year-old whose laughter was a compass for a family who never stopped following it. Evie Hart's case was solved in the sense that the law had a name and a gavel to bring down. But some answers are rooms with the lights dimmed, the kind of answers that force a town to remodel itself on the inside. If you want to know what Frank found when he pushed his finger into that marginal box and pulled at the thread it hid, if you want to hear the secret that made the sheriff pause and the reporter put down his pen, if you want to see where the map led toward other towns and other dates and a string that ran further than anyone expected, then come back. There's more to this story. Photographs in boxes that never saw daylight, men who smiled at Sunday school and had keys to rooms no one else knew, and a single stubborn truth that refused to be corralled by verdicts or the neatness of headlines. Because what justice begins in court, truth finishes in the daylight we give it. And Evie is still waiting in the photograph, braid undone, chin resting on her hands, listening as if the world means to tell her everything. Continue like you're sitting beside me. Voice low and urgent, listen. Frank kept the maps spread across his kitchen table, like someone laying out a world to be remade. The paper flapped from the drafts in his little house. His coffee had gone cold. Outside, Kalamazoo breathed an ordinary winter night. Inside, the room was full of ghosts that moved like old furniture. The shoebox, the Polaroid, the marginal pencil box on a map. He had traced that tiny square 3 times, and each time it tugged at him with the same stubborn insistence. Someone had marked it for a reason once long ago, in a hand that thought the marking important then, and had been forgotten by everyone else. Frank went back to the department files. He spread Evie's old folder on the station table and began cross-referencing, an old man with a new obsession, working the way people do when they will not let a life go. He pulled the roster of drivers for the district in 1968. He copied bus route logs. He checked vehicle registrations for trucks that had been seen near Lincoln Elementary that September. Paper after paper. Names he had once crossed out as irrelevant started to stand up and look back at him like men waiting at a bus stop. The truck, the second truck in the Polaroid note, became his first obsession. Witness accounts had been thin and contradictory, grayish. One person had said, large, another. Someone at the diner had told a reporter they thought it was an Army surplus vehicle. Another remembered an advertising logo on the door. In the files, a terse report noted a license plate fragment. 3 letters scrawled by a tired deputy. It read, someone had written, D-A-W, Dawes. The name rang a bell. A family-run hauling outfit, Dawes and Sons, had been in and out of town all the 3rd week of September, hauling away demolition from a friend's barn and picking up old boilers. In 1968, Dawes and Sons had 3 trucks. The company was run by a man everyone called Walt Dawes, a broad, genial fellow who wore good boots and worse jokes, who sponsored the Little League and lent his trucks to the church rummage sale. He was the kind of man who got his picture in the paper handing over a check to the school fund. Frank drove out to where Dawes and Sons used to be. The old metal shed had been replaced by a vinyl bungalow and a swing set. He found, however, a few neighbors who remembered Walt and his boys. One of them, a woman named Margaret Hollis, had been a teenager then and spat the name like someone naming a boil. They were always in town, she said, voice flat. Always hauling stuff. One of the boys could charm the teeth off a statue. She pointed Frank toward old employment lists kept in the archive of the county clerk. There, with a little scraping and some careful transcription, Frank found payroll stubs dated the week Evie vanished. One name kept appearing, R. Hollis, hauling crew. Another, H. Dawes. A third, Hakeem. Arthur's name was already the axis of their earlier work. His sweater, his DNA. But now Arthur's name was sitting in a cluster with other men who had keys to the world the town took for granted. The hauling trucks, the empty lots behind schools, the half-abandoned washroom by the river. The geography of the town, its alleys, its service roads, its forgotten backways, had, it seemed, been more frequented by certain people than anyone had logged at the time. Frank's next call was to Lillian. Her memory had opened like a wound when she saw Arthur's face on television, but she had not been able to say much then. On the phone, her voice trembled, but she agreed to meet. She sat at the end of a bench in the park where Evie had once played, hands clasped like a rosary. Her hair had gone white at the temples. Her eyes were the glass of something that had been watered too often. "I saw a license plate that day," she said without prompting. And for a moment Frank felt the old thrill of being a detective, not the television kind, but the sort that listens until someone gives you a corner of light. "I wrote it down because I thought it might be important. I was cleaning bus windows back then, and I write down the plates of trucks that idled near the school. I kept things. I always kept things." She handed him a small, folded slip of paper. The handwriting had faded, but the letters were clear. WDS. A city clerk's shorthand for Walders? A different reading? Frank felt something tighten. WDS. The initials matched the Dawes trucks. He pressed the paper flat to the map where the Polaroid's tiny square sat, and then ran a finger along the bus route to the east. The route curved, crossed a low bridge, then opened into an industrial stretch where a quarry and a small funeral home had once operated beside a long, narrow river. Why would a hauling truck be there? Frank asked. Lillian shrugged. They hauled everything. Frank thought about hauling. He thought about doors opened by men in good hands who were given keys. He thought about trust as a chain, one link handing another thing it could not refuse to carry. He thought about how many things are transported in the back of a truck that people never ask about. Old furniture, dead appliances, rotten things meant to be left at the dump. He thought about how a person could be moved in a truck and no one would raise an eyebrow. Back at his house, Frank opened the drawer where the Polaroid had lain. He held the photograph under a lamp and looked for anything else that might have been missed. A smudge, a reflection, a license plate half hidden behind a child's shoulder. He photographed it with the camera and enlarged the print. In a high contrast to the new image, a strip of lettering on the truck door resolved into a faded decal, a logo with a stylized river and the letters Hollis beneath it. Hollis. The name was both familiar and poisonous. Hollis Funeral Home. Margaret Hollis had been in town, but the funeral home had been run by her family. A quiet business with large ledgers and larger hands. Funeral directors know how to move bodies. It was a thought that made Frank rub his forehead until the map blurred. Funeral homes are also repositories of consent and secrecy. In 1968, a funeral director could consign a coffin to the ground and whisper things in the margins of ledgers that no one would read until years later. Frank felt the hair lift on the back of his neck. He made the call. The Hollis Funeral Home was still in the family, though under a different name and with different smiles. The current owner, an elderly man named Reuben Hollis, answered the door with an apology for the clutter of a life. Frank said he was checking records. Reuben's hands trembled where they held the family ledger. "You want to see old invoices?" Reuben asked, cautious. The way men keep the keys to legacy safe. Frank watched the ledger as if it were a map, looking for notes that did not read like the rest. Funeral homes keep business in a ledger's neat columns. Names, dates, services rendered. Ink from 1968 had browned but remained legible. It took Frank a while to find the entries that spiked like a thorn. A string of small payments over months, never for funerals, but for transport, Paul, pickup. The payments were modest enough to look like routine accounting, and the payers were curious in the same way as the sawed-off files he had found earlier. Dawes and Sons, R. Hollis a relative, and a name he knew too well, A. King. There was a second ledger in the back. Frank didn't expect to find it. He almost didn't look. It was a ledger the size of a Bible, and when he opened, the paper smelled of old perfume and dust. Its entries were not written in neat accounting script. They were brief, clinical, like a summary a doctor might make after examining something he had no words for. Dates, initials, locations. He read the first line out loud because he needed to hear it like the rest of us, as if the voice could make the words less monstrous. September 2nd, 68, E.H. R. Quarry Road, pickup, R.H. E.H. Evie Hart, R.H. R. Hollis. Frank's hands went cold. He flipped more pages. He ledger continued, page after page. Names with initials. Dates that ran in clusters through the late 60s. Then sparse entries through the 70s. Then a scattering in the 80s. Each entry was a number and the shorthand of movement. Some had notes, night, dry ground, double move. There were items crossed out, corrections made in different inks, a smudge that looked like a fingerprint. Frank closed the ledger, and the room seemed to shrink. He took the book carefully, thanked Reuben with a voice that did not sound like his, and stepped back into the daylight with a winter tasted like iron on his tongue. When Frank called Martha and Tom Hart, he could not bring himself to speak the ledger's words. He told them instead that he had found new evidence that suggested the case was wider than Arthur Keene. He could hear Martha's breath catch over the line. Tom's silence had the weight of a father's bone. "You found something?" Martha asked at last. "We found a book," Frank said. "A ledger. It mentions Evie." There was a pause, and then a small sound, the low, terrible sound people make when a dam cracks. "Come to the house," Martha said. He did, and the Hart sat together and folded their hands and looked at each other like people who had been given a map to a place they did not want to visit. The ledger changed everything and nothing. It gave them a new path to anger, to the possibility of other names. But it also confirmed the suspicion they had carried like a bedspread for 36 years. That Evie's disappearance had not been a lone act of a vanishing man, but connected to movements that had been recorded in books meant never to be read. Frank did not move fast in the way the television detectives do. He moved like a man who has carried 36 years of failure and now bears the fragile hope of rightness carefully, because everything could crumble with one misstep. He formed a small team for the county, a young prosecutor who smelled of books and righteous impatience, a crime scene tech who had earned her bones working cold cases, and a uniformed deputy who had the memory of how a town breathes. They went back to the quarry. The quarry had changed since 1968. It had been partially filled in, fenced, then abandoned and then tamed again with volunteer cleanups. They found an old dirt track that had been used for hauling stone. At the edge of one hollow, behind a thick stand of sumac and where the river bent away, Frank found a patch of disturbed earth. It had been smoothed over and then disguised with grass like a bruise hidden under sleeve. They opened ground with the care of surgeons, unpeeling a long wound. It was slow, and the work smelled of earth and long-settled things. The first items were small, a child's shoe, woven in a pattern Frank remembered from Evie's photograph, a button, a scrap of fabric with fibers that might have been tie. They photographed everything. They bagged everything. The items were small as prayers. They were the kind of small human things that the dead and the living both hold on to. When they lifted a tin box with a rusted latch, the way they all held their breath was like the way people held the world when gossip could kill. Protective, afraid. Inside the tin were small, intimate tokens. A locket with initials worn into its brass EH, a broken charm bracelet with a round pendant, and a Polaroid, one more edges crooked, taken in the sun with the same ridiculous innocence that had once been a girl's laugh. Frank felt the air leave his chest. The Polaroid showed a group of men, faces half hidden in shadows, a truck in the background with the same Hollis decal Frank had seen on the other photograph. Evie was in the photograph too, a blur of braids and a white dress. She was held in the arms of a man with steady hands and a soft jaw. He looked almost like a neighbor. He looked like someone who could be trusted with keys and with sleep. The men around him smiled the way men who share a secret smile. The lab processed the items with a speed born of the patience of people who have learned not to be surprised by grief. The DNA from the locket matched Evie. The fibers matched the scrap from the shoebox. The Polaroid's background under close enhancement revealed something else that made the prosecutor's pen stop in the margin of the report. A symbol on a jacket. A small embroidered badge that read Lodge for 29. A lodge. A place where men gather. Where handshakes seal things and names are kept on lists and keys are often passed to those in the confidence of brotherhood. Frank had been afraid of lodges since he was a boy. They were part of the architecture of small towns, a place where the rules were private and the privileges public. The ledger entries, the truck decals, the funeral home invoices, and now the lodge insignia. Like beads on a thread, they suggested a chain of people moving goods and keeping their mouths closed. The sheriff called a press conference with the carefulness of a man who knows he is about to light a fuse in a powder room. He said that they had found new evidence. He did not name names. The town's response was immediate and electric. Some people came with casseroles and calls of thank God. Others came with picket signs and accusations. The paper ran an editorial that asked what the town had known and not said. The radio station spun with callers. The same voices that had once tacked up missing posters at the hardware store now calling in with memory and suspicion. Frank, the prosecutor, and the detective pulled at the thread. Lodge 429's membership rolls were public in the way fraternal organization rolls are. Names, addresses, dates. Some members were dead. Some were old men who could no longer stand. Some were men who had children who remembered them standing at school bake sales and singing hymns. Names on the ledger matched names in the lodge log and in the funeral home ledger. A small pattern had the geometric feel of something deliberate. The prosecutor convened a grand jury. Subpoenas were issued. Men who had been pillars in the town, a man who taught Sunday school, a local businessman who had donated the flagpole on Main, a former PTA president, were called in to testify. The town watched as the courthouse filled with men who had once been found in photographs, shaking hands and handing over pies. The grand jury's work was slow and difficult. Many men invoked memory loss or claimed the ledger was nothing more than an old man's bookkeeping. Some told the truth plainly. They had signed off on invoices for transports because the funeral home sometimes hauled junk between jobs. Others refused to answer on the grounds that it would incriminate them. The prosecutor found fingerprints on the rusted tin box. A thumbprint matched a man who, until then, had been as beloved as the church steeple. Franklin Walt Dawes. When Walt was asked about his thumbprint on a box that contained a child's locket with EH scratched into the brass, his face blanked like paint scrambling. He said he could not remember. He said he had been hauling for the town for 20 years, and sometimes he took things out of the back of trucks to save from trash. He said he had done stuff to try and help, moved broken toys, rescued lilies that had fallen into ditches. And he said he could not explain the ledger. You spared things from a dump? The prosecutor asked. Things that you found in your work? Walt swallowed. He looked like a man who had believed in himself as an honest man, and now saw his hands reflected in a mirror that did not flatter. His alibi fractured under the cold light of facts. The ledger had entries that matched dates when Evie's name had been entered into the missing reports. Dawes harumphed and said he had been working long hours hauling, and sometimes he let his boys, young men with access to the roads at odd hours, handle the details. He said he had trusted them as any man trusts his sons. The ledger, though, was not an accidental record. It read like minutes taken by someone who was not apologetic but clinical. The prosecution argued that the ledger was a record of systematic movement, a network that moved children's bodies and then recorded who moved what and when. The defense argued contamination. The defense argued that the town's inclination to see patterns after a verdict had already been reached was a dangerous thing. The judge allowed motions. The pages of the proceedings became heavy with procedure. Then a woman named Lillian testified again. And this time she said exactly what she had felt for decades but had never spoken into words. I was a cleaner of buses, she told the jurors, voice sharper than before. I saw things. I saw trucks where they shouldn't be. I wrote things down and I put them in my pocket and I forgot about them. She produced a small collection of Polaroids she had tucked into a tin under her bed for 40 years. Nobody had ever asked her for them. She had kept them because they had comforted her and terrified her in equal measure. When the Polaroids were developed and examined, one showed a portion of a ledger page, a razor-thin sliver of handwriting, and under a folding, someone had scrawled a list of initials. One initial, clear as a bell, matched the man Walt Dawes kept close. R.H. The town did not know what to do with the knowledge that men they had smiled at had been in bad company. Friendship strained. The church canceled the service to let the congregation speak. Mothers refused carpools with certain fathers. The little grocery on Elm Street put up a sign that read "For the children," and people paused in front of it like they paused at a grave. The grand jury returned indictments. Men were charged with crimes that the statute names with difficulty: conspiracy to conceal a death, accessory after the fact, multiple counts of obstruction. They were not all charged with murder. The evidence had to be careful and incontrovertible for that charge. What the ledger had done was to turn suspicion into a scaffold on which prosecutors could build an argument. Some men pleaded not guilty. Others, the ones with more to hide, slid into silence. The courtroom became less a place of clarity and more a place of muscles tensing and then releasing. A particular hearing, the one the paper called the Ledger hearing, was televised on the local station and watched by a town that turned its faces toward the window as if at a terrible play. Then came the letter. It arrived in an envelope without a return address, the way the Polaroid had. Inside was a page folded in half, written in an old-fashioned cursive that made the words look like a relic. The writer claimed to be a son of one of the Ledger's signatories. He confessed, not in detail, not in the way a court needs, but enough to make the heart of the accusation pulse. He said he had helped move things when he was young and drunk with fear and loyalty to the men who taught him the meaning of silence. He said, "We thought we were protecting something. We thought we were protecting our way of life." Then, in a line that made the room constrict like a fist, he wrote, "There were more than we thought." The prosecutor paced the floor that night and flung his coat over the chair, as if throwing his body into motion could cast off a chill. He felt, as many people feel, the particular horror of a human ledger, one that records names and dates and the small transactions of moral failure. A ledger that shows not a single crime but a system of choices made by men who had the power to choose otherwise. He felt, too, the cold wave of fear. If the ledger was only the beginning, how far did it run? How many towns, how many refrigeration trucks, how many little boxes stacked in dark garages contained the same neat list of initials? The trial of the men named in the ledger became a trial not only of individuals, but of a town's conscience. Witnesses told of nights where men met at the lodge and left with their hands conspiring. Others told of charity drives where donations doubled as cover for other movement. The defense painted the ledger as the ramblings of a man with money troubles, as a book of transactions done in a different era when paperwork did not mean the same thing it did now. Then, in the midst of the legal wash, an archivist in a neighboring county did what archivists do. She dug. The news that Kalamazoo was looking for its past had seeped into other places, and people began to look into their own boxes. In an anonymous file at an old county office, a clerk found a photograph that matched one of Lillian's Polaroids. On the backside, in the same slanted hand as before, an address had been penciled: County Line Road, Track 12. Frank put on his coat and drove until asphalt gave way to gravel and gravel to a track that only the newest pickup would have forgiven. The tract was a shallow field, a place where the ground sloped to a culvert and a thicket of pines. It looked like a place made for forgetting by design. He walked where shoes had scuffed paths. He stepped where the earth was packed. He found a depression like a lung under a body. They dug there, and what they found made even the old men who had sat in courtrooms grow thinner in the face. A small cluster of shallow graves, the soft, exposed bones of children, artifacts carefully wrapped as if someone had meant them to be remembered. No graphic detail, just the terrible fact of small lives placed in the earth and then covered. The DNA team did their work with the slow surgical precision of people who know how to make the dead speak. A match was made. One of the graves carried a fragment of clothing that, once analyzed and cross-referenced to the evidence they had pulled from the quarry and the funeral home, matched Evie Hart's profile. It was proof enough to reopen undigested pain and harden the faces of those who had once been able to rest. When the news broke, the town's reaction was volcanic. There were vigils and angry town hall meetings where neighbors shouted at neighbors. People stopped greeting each other the way they had for generations. Parents, who had once nodded to men who tutored children and who sang at church, looked at them instead with the cold, assessing eyes of people who know their children are worth guarding with suspicion until the world earns back trust. The judge allowed the prosecution to upgrade charges. Men were indicted for murder. The lodge's charter was suspended. The funeral home, the quiet, respectable place where grieving families had gone for decades, closed under the weight of subpoenas and protests. Reuben Hollis, who had been so careful with his books, was arrested and sat in a cell staring at a small fold-out mirror until the color drained from his face. Walt Dawes was taken quietly from his porch in boots that had never been polished for prison. The town that had once sponsored his pictures in the paper held its breath. Yet even as guilt took the shape of arrest records, and as the court called witnesses to sit under oath and tell their ugly truths, there remained things that did not resolve. There were dozens of ledger entries with initials that did not correspond to any name they could find. There were phone numbers that returned no one. There were men who had died with secrets in their chests, and who would take their knowledge with them into the grave, unread and unjudged. And then some small, stubborn person who had been following the case not for fame, but because she could not look, opened a drawer and found a pad of forms. The forms were the kind a lodge uses for charity records, blank places for names and addresses. But tucked inside the pad was a scrap of paper with a child's handwriting that made the soup of the town's grief curdle anew. Evie had written a list of things she wanted to be when she grew up: a teacher, a baker, a person who could keep birds on her windowsill. The list had been pinned under the ledger in Lillian's box, as if someone had saved it for reasons they could not name. The story had bent the town into a question they could not answer. The courtroom filings were long and detailed. Lawyers moved their pieces like people who believe strategy can outmuscle horror. Prosecutors called expert witnesses. Defendants looked as all men do when confronted with the end of a life they had relied on, a life of reputations and small honors, as if someone had peeled off the varnish. Then came the final, chilling thing. On the last day of the trial, in an afternoon that was bright with a sun that felt obscene and ordinary, the prosecutor produced a small, brown envelope and walked it to the witness stand. He turned it and then slowly opened it. Inside was a Polaroid unlike the others, glossy and fresh because someone had kept it safe all this time. It depicted a place everyone thought peaceful: a church hall, a Sunday afternoon bake sale, kids in paper hats. Evie in a white dress at the center of it, smiling with a completeness that made people forget, if only for a heartbeat, what they had come to court for. Around her stood men in their Sunday best. The faces were faces everyone in the town recognized. Men who had led prayer meetings, men who had given scholarships, men who had been photographed at the ribbon cuttings for the new community center. And there, at the far edge of the photo, hands folded and head slightly bowed, was someone whose face made the judge involuntarily lean forward. Mayor Caldwell, the mayor who had presided over the town's ribbon cuttings and whose name had been in every welcome packet, was in the photograph. He wore a lapel pin with the same lodge insignia Frank had seen before. The room convulsed with a sound that was not one voice but many at once, a low collective intake, as if people's lungs had been filled with facts that could not be borne. The mayor's lawyer shouted that the picture did not mean anything, that being in a photograph with someone did not equal guilt. The mayor himself sat, his face the color that comes when a man's name is taken from a public altar and set on a private hook. Then the prosecutor, with a small, dangerous smile, reached into his sleeve and pulled out one more thing: a note. It had been folded dozens of times and smoothed and folded again, like a confession someone had not been brave enough to say out loud. The handwriting slow and careful. Read, "We never meant to have to choose. We never meant to be found." The judge called for order and for recess. Outside the courthouse, People stood in clusters like broken statues, mouths open and frost forming on their scarves. Children who had been brought by their parents pressed their faces to the windows and watched the grown people arguing over the idea of them. The mayor resigned the next day, saying little beyond a forced apology. His resignation cracked the town like an egg on a stone. Men who had once been asked to lead fundraisers now found themselves barred from church halls. The lodge's door hung like a wound to the wall, its brass plaque turned and unreadable. When the verdicts finally came, they were mixed. Some men convicted on counts of conspiracy to conceal deaths, others acquitted for lack of direct connection. The judge, pressed between law and communal vengeance, handed sentences that tried to account both for the years of silence and the new knowledge of deliberate acts. Men who had been pillars were led away, not in the brutal way the town's newscasters had promised, but with the slow, dispassionate rhythm of the legal system. The town had a list of names now that would not be washed away by time. But there was more. In a drawer of the mayor's desk, found by a young intern who was not yet jaded enough to hide what she had found, was a key. The key had a small tag with a number that matched a storage unit across the county line. When the unit was opened, the things inside were the kind of accumulations that forced the living to explain. Boxes of photographs, calendars annotated in a code the intern could not decipher, and one final Polaroid that made the room tilt. The Polaroid showed Evie in a kitchen older, a woman with the same braid as a child who had kept a thread of habit. She stood at a counter, her hands curled around a cup. Behind her in the doorway was a man whose face the camera had not captured fully. The man wore a jacket with an insignia, not the lodge's, but the badge of a company that operated outside the town's borders. The Polaroid had been taken in the 70s, someone guessed. If the image were real and literal, as photographs sometimes are in their terrible, honest way, the woman in the picture could not have been Evie Hart because Evie Hart had been known by the town to be a girl who had disappeared. The prosecutor held the Polaroid up in the dim light of the chamber and then, with a voice that exhausted itself against its own steadiness, read a line from the back of the picture written in the same hand that had littered so many things with secrets. Where we hide them, we hide ourselves. The room went silent like a church. There are endings that let the living rest, and there are endings that only rearrange the furniture of the truth. In Kalamazoo, the trials and the indictments and the ledger and the graves laid a foundation of fact. Men were punished. The mayor had resigned. The lodge shuttered its door. The funeral home closed. But the last Polaroid, the one with a woman who might have been Evie or might have been somebody else entirely, arrived like a seed of doubt that took root and pushed up. If Evie's image had been true in that photograph, then the ledger and the graves were only one part of the story, a chapter. If she had been photographed later, alive, then the system had been more monstrous than anyone imagined. Not only were the crimes hidden, but someone had gone to the trouble to create the appearance of the past, to keep a life in a loop of lies. No one in Kalamazoo could agree on which was worse, that the town had harbored heinous acts and hidden them behind a veneer of respectability, or that someone had faked evidence so convincingly and with such malice that even the dead could be made to lie. The two possibilities left people like moths against a bright window, drawn to the light and permanently scorched. Frank kept the final Polaroid in a drawer under a photograph of Evie that Martha had given him. He would take it out sometimes at night and look at the woman in the kitchen as if the picture might fray its edges and reveal a secret. He would place his thumb where he once found dirt on a shoebox and feel in the small roughness the truth that people make their lives on and then bury. On an evening that smelled of wet leaves and the first promises of spring, Frank drove to the edge of town and stood by the river where a small bench bore a plaque in Evie's name. He placed his hand on the plaque and read her name aloud. The town was quiet. The air had the slow coldness of things not yet healed. Behind him the streetlights buzzed. A car passed and the sound of its engine faded. A figure came down the path toward him, someone he did not know, and stopped a respectful distance away. The person was wrapped in a coat, hands in pockets, head bowed. "You found her," the stranger said softly. Frank looked up. "Found who?" The things, the stranger said. The records, the pictures, the ledger. You found them. For us. Frank did not know if he was supposed to feel vindicated or shrugged. He was tired, more tired than he had any right to be. Why now, he asked. The stranger straightened. Because we never stopped telling the stories to the people who would listen, the person said. Because some of us kept the memory like a coal in our palms. Because we wanted the truth to be put down and named. And you? Frank asked. The stranger reached into a pocket and drew out a small, folded photograph. It was old edges, softened by years. He handed it to Frank with the sort of small, steady movement people use when they give you something that will change how you remember the world. Frank unfolded it. There, in the blurred light of the photograph, was Evie Hart, older by a decade or two, seated at a table with a man whose face he could not see, but whose hands were steady. The woman's braid had been cut and tied back. Her eyes were the same as in the school photograph, watchful, bright, and funny in a way that suggested mischief. On the back of the photograph, scrawled in a tight, hurried script, were 3 words. Find her name. The stranger inhaled. You've got parts, he said. You've got men punished, you've got graves. But you don't have an answer to the last question. What was done to those who survived? Who took care of them? Who kept them from screaming and then set them down like a parcel in a different town? Frank felt the cold of the river steal up his bones. The town had been divided and stitched and then bruised all over again. The ledger was a compass that had pointed to graves and to the names of men. The Polaroid in the stranger's hand was an ember that promised there were still places left in the dark. Who gave you that? Frank asked. The stranger did not answer. He turned and walked away, the town's lights fanning out and swallowing him until he was a silhouette and then nothing more. Frank folded the photograph and slid it into his jacket. He had no map for what this photograph implied. He only knew one thing with a clarity that burned. The story of Evie Hart, the story that had begun as a missing poster on a lamppost and which had unrolled into a ledger and a quarry and a town made thin, was not finished. Weeks later, on a morning that began with a raw wind, a reporter broke a new headline. A body had been found in a neighboring county, identified by dental records as someone long reported missing in 1975. The name printed under the photograph in the paper made people's hands go cold. It was the name of a woman who had once volunteered as a youth counselor and who had in the 70s vanished without so much as a whisper. Her disappearance had been folded into a rumor, then a rumor into a sigh. The town read the name and then read the ledger and then the list of names on the lodge membership and then the Polaroids like a line of dominoes that refused to stand easy. People began to look at their portraits in the foyer mirrors and wonder how many smiles were honest. Children learned what the newspapers had always tried to shield them from, that people are capable of hiding terrible things, and that the cost of silence can be a life. Frank sat alone at the kitchen table with the last Polaroid under his palm. He felt the ledger like a weight still strapped to him, and he felt the photograph in his breast like a promise that something else would be found if they kept looking. He also felt, like a dull ache, the slow realization that the ledger, the graves, the mayor's name, these were only chapters in a book with other pages yet to be opened. The photograph in his jacket felt like a hand reaching from under a bed. He slid it into the shoebox with Evie's other photographs. He closed the lid slowly. The way people close the door on a room they mean to return to. Outside, the town carried on with its brutal newness. People wore their suspicion like new coats. The lodge closed its doors, but the building remained. The mayor left town, but his name lingered like smoke. And under the bench by the river, the plaque with Evie's name looked small and honest and utterly insufficient. Then, one night when the snow had begun to fall and the town sat under a hush like a hell breath, the county lab called Frank. They had run the scrap from the latest find, the photograph the stranger had given him, through the database, the new, vast one that linked samples across states. The computer hummed and spat out a result that, if true, would make a new kind of silence spread across Kalamazoo. The scrap's DNA matched no one on the rolls. It matched, however, to a profile flagged in a different state. A man who had been in the military and who had changed his name, A man who had lived many lives under many names and who, by the way his fingerprints crawled across the paper, had been exacting about leaving no trace. Frank drove that night without stopping, the map in his head a line from the bench to that man's last known address. He felt the old thrill returning. The possibility of a last page of a book, of finding an answer so complete that the bones could finally rest. He had imagined it often, in the quiet between calls and the long hours when he could not sleep. When he reached the address and pushed on the door, someone answered. A woman with hair the color of wire and eyes that had gone to strange lengths to look unremarkable. She smiled just a corner of her mouth and asked him if he needed help. Frank held up a photograph. She did not take it. She looked at him the way a person looks when they have been waiting for someone to come, and at last the knocking has become polite enough to acknowledge. Her voice was a small thing. "They found my son," she said. "They found him in a picture." He asked her if she knew Evie Hart. She held her breath like a man about to dive. "I put Evie in the hands of people I trusted once," she said. "I thought they would keep her safe. We were all fooled by people wearing good shoes. We all made choices. I thought we were keeping them safe. We weren't. We were hiding what we feared. We hid our shame in ledgers and lockboxes. We traded hair ribbons for silence." Frank listened, and the world narrowed to the sound of the woman's breath. "Where's your son now?" he asked. She looked at the wall and then away, and for the first time her face was a fissure. "He's been dead 10 years, she said, and he carried his secrets like a trophy. He left them on a shelf for someone to find when he was gone." Frank felt the ground slip beneath him in a way he had not known could happen. The ledger had been the towns, the lodges, the funeral homes. The Polaroids had been the small, private things a man might leave to mock the living. But the last thing the woman said, the one that would curl the town's tongue for years, was this: "We hid things not only because we were bad. We hid them because we were human, and because, when you are given access to others' ruin, the coward's way is sometimes to look away. And the ledger is only the footprint of the people who could not bear to keep looking." Frank left the house without his answers. He drove back to the river bench where the plaque sat like a small planet. The snow fell clean, and the town's lights cast a dim halo. He put his hand on the plaque and spoke Evie's name into the night. And the last thing the town would learn, the thing that would sit heavy on the lips of pastors and paper boys and mothers for a generation, was not a neat, terrible truth carved into stone. It was a simple, chilling fact that arrived like the cold that gets under your coat in the deepest hour of winter. The ledger had been only one ledger. There were others in other towns with other initials, and some of the names on those pages were people whose grandchildren went to the same schools as children in Kalamazoo. The network they had found was not an island. It was a chain made by men who believed their hands were clean because they never asked what was inside the boxes they moved. The town could punish some and mourn many. It could bury a few more bones and shine the brass plaque at Evie's bench. It could lure the guilty into court and watch them stand and see the faces of people they had harmed. But the ledger's last cruelty was this: it confirmed something everyone had always understood in part and denied in whole. Evil can live in the house next door. It can wear the flip of church coat. It can sign checks to the school board and sing at the 4th of July picnic. The ledger only measured the ways a town had built a wall around its shame. On the final morning of the year, when frost clung like a promise to windows and children pressed noses to glass to watch the world wait, the paper ran a headline that read simply, "More ledgers found." Under it was a list of towns, names of people once considered pillars, and the photograph no one could explain. Evie smiling in a kitchen, older by decades as if the years had not mattered. The man in the doorway, whose face no record could place. Martha read the paper with trembling hands and then walked to the bench and placed a small bouquet. She stayed until snow had melted to slush and every passerby had averted their eyes. She did not speak to Frank that day. She did not need to. The town had done what towns do. It had torn itself open and bled into the gutters. The ledger had done what a ledger does. It had refused to let a story be only what it had been told to be. The final line of the last report, the one that would thread through the town's memory for years, read, The ledger told part of the truth. The photograph promised the rest. The rest, the part that would haunt the town like an echo without a source, remained to be found. That night, as Kalamazoo slid into a sleep that felt small and unsure, a man in a jacket with no name drove past the school. He slowed at the light and watched the bench by the river, and then continued into the dark, like someone who carries a photograph in his wallet and keeps his mouth shut, because men with keys have always known the value of silence. Frank kept the shoebox, the Polaroids, and the ledger in a safe drawer at the station. He would open it sometimes at night, the lamp on low, and imagine the ledger's other pages opening like a book whose last chapter no one yet had the courage to read. Evie's photograph sat on his mantel as if she had been living there the whole time, waiting for the town's courage to catch up to its crimes. People came and went, leaving flowers, candles, and confessions in voicemail form. The town made apologies and new rules. The lodge closed its doors. Children learned new ways to cross streets and lock doors. But the ledger's last, most chilling gift, the one that refused to be buried by verdicts or headlines, was the sense that in a town's chest there might still beat a secret heart that no single prosecutor could fully excise. That in a line of names in a ledger buried under dust and time, there might be an index to where other truths lay hidden. That Evie's story, even when legally solved, would echo into other towns and into other nights. And on one bitter, still night, when the snow had glazed the porches and the world seemed held in a single careful breath, someone pinned a new poster to the old lamppost by the school. It was not a missing person poster. It had no photo, no age. It simply read in blunt black letters, "If you know of another ledger, tell US." Underneath, in smaller print, someone had written a single word that would not let the town rest. Remember. That word settled like dust across the town. It was a summons and a sentence. It meant the story was not yet done. It meant the ledger had more pages. It meant the town in its collective sleepwalking had to wake up and look at itself, not as a group of respectable citizens, but as a place where choices had been made and where old choices had consequences. So the town waited, not for an ending that would come clean and bright, but for the rest of a ledger to be found, for names to be read aloud, for the truth to live in light rather than ledger, for Evie to be at last only Evie, a child who had liked broken toys and braids in her hair. And if you ever find yourself in a small town, looking at a photograph pinned to a corkboard, ask yourself what else is written in the margins, because the ledger is patient. It waits for someone with the courage to read every page. Before you go, make sure to hit subscribe, tap like, and turn on notifications. That way you'll never miss the next mystery cold case we uncover together. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I appreciate every single one of you for supporting this journey.